Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 2nd of January. Thank you all so much for the support on yesterday's video. And today's upload will be focusing on updates in Zaporizhia, Velyka Novosilka, Dnipro, Pokrovsk, and finally Siversk. On the Pokrovsk front, we're going to look at how the Russians are now 7.5 kilometers away from the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. We'll also look at a lot of the new fortifications, including trenches and anti-tank ditches built by the Ukrainian side. We'll also look at the topography in that location because it's going to be a really important part of the front line for the next year. So it's better to get accustomed to it at the beginning of the year. Let's zoom in and begin with Velyka, where you can see that the Russians have been able to advance 1.7 square kilometers. And in terms of the horizontal advance, they pushed 1.6 kilometers westwards. That is a relatively deep advance in relation to the static nature of fighting in this part of the front line, just to the east of Kharkiv. We have not seen many changes at all in Zaporizhia front besides the Ukrainian attack that pushed deeper into Kamyansk. And that was like 2 weeks ago now, where the Ukrainians at most took 7 square kilometers. But here you can see the Russian 70th Motor Rifle Regiment was able to take over the eastern portion of this village, and now much of it is under a gray zone. They released this, I think, 5-minute compilation where the beginning of it just showcased an ungodly amount of FPV strikes or drones dropping grenades onto various Ukrainian positions in houses or in trenches and dugouts built nearby. So this was the means by which the Russians were able to disconnect the Ukrainians from the front line, and then they moved in with the ground soldiers and took up positions in these eastern houses. And it's always the most difficult to break through that initial front line after, say, a year and a half plus of just static fighting, because both sides have become so ingrained and so comfortable in their initial positions. And during that time period, they become very familiar with the terrain and with basically every single landmark nearby. So then it's hard to overrun it. They're very, very seeped into a particular location. So then when you do see the beginning of a new change and a new attack vector, it's always the most difficult at the beginning. But after that drone work by the Russian side, they were able to break through in this location and take over the initial eastern portion. They raised their flag on the destroyed water tower, and that's how the front line looks for now, with the Ukrainians located in the western portion of the village. Now, a bit to the northeast, you can see on the Velyka Novosilka front, the Russians have taken over, what is this, 0.8 square kilometers of territory. They're in the process of enveloping Niskuchnia. Niskuchnia is the final village before reaching the Velyka Novosilka cluster, which I would say is connected to Vermivka directly. So Niskuchnia is one of the final villages before the Russians really begin to put pressure onto the city from another axis. Because right now, Velyka Novosilka is enduring really difficult clashes to the east, where they've been able to stabilize the situation for over a month. So in this location, they have been able to maintain defense, and it's basically the area that you'd expect to be attacked. Besides the southern front, the east and the south were always the most likely candidates for where the pressure would come from, and you could see how the Ukrainians prepared for that with a lot of fortresses and dugouts being built at entry points to the city, because you do have a lot of roads leading into it. There are actually 7 roads that connect within Velyka Novosilka. So a lot of the defenses were built around this eastern edge. To the north, the fighting is dragging out in Novi Komar, where the Ukrainians have moved in a lot of reinforcements to ensure that there can't be a deep Russian push coming in from the north. And now you're seeing, besides the southern fronts, where there's also heavy clashes, another part of the front line that's beginning to manifest as a danger for the garrison here would be from the west, because you do have this new advance. Ever since the advance about a week and a half ago that allowed the Russians to push deeper and cut off the road between Huliapoli to Velyka Novosilka, they've been able to expand their salient and continue pushing eastwards. So now you can see that the Russians are, say, 1.5 kilometers away from Skuchnia and less than 2 kilometers away from Vermivka. So the battlefield is really being shaped in a way that is uncomfortable for the defenders here, because imagine trying to go in and out. Imagine trying to resupply with any private vehicle or any armored vehicle moving through these regions. It would be very tenuous. It would be very easy for Russians on either side of the Mokriali River to spot them and direct artillery fire or directly fire towards them. And it's hard to maintain a large force, a large defensive force, which is what is necessary in order to prevent Russian attacks from all directions in such a concentrated area that is so exposed to fire from basically higher elevation in all directions. So that's something to keep in mind as the battle in Velyka Novosilka continues to rage on, but the extent of the Russian advances has decreased in recent days. That does not mean that the fighting and the attrition rates have not fallen off during that time period. Now, looking at Andriivka, we're going to zoom in here, and there is new footage from the 37th Marine Brigade. This time, they hit 3 Russian armored vehicles, including 1 Russian equivalent of an MRAP, and they dropped grenades onto the Russian troops that dismounted from those damaged vehicles. The troops dismounted in this specific tree line, and now they've been able to approach Antarna even closer. So it's been the case really since the beginning of the Russian campaign along the Sukhuyali River that it's taken multiple attempts by Russian armored columns to break through the Ukrainian line and actually infiltrate into a village, even if it is relatively small. That's really the story of what happened in Novomikhailivka, and then every a succeeding village all along this line going northwestwards. So now you're seeing a similar thing unfold around Yantarna, but to a smaller extent because now the Russians have a better linchpin in Uspanivka through which to launch attacks. It's closer to the front line, and generally the garrison, the Russian garrison that is conducting offensive activity, is much more experienced and is much more adept at conducting these sort of attacks. So now this is assault number 2. The first one was able to push from Uspanivka to the polygon that you see over here in this color, this reddish color, on December 29th. And then this one is from December 31st. Russian troops were able to push a bit further westwards, and now they really are at the gates of Yantarna, which is a small village. So once the Russians actually reach it in earnest and get some sort of foothold, it becomes extremely difficult to expel them, and it becomes pretty easy for the Russians to then expand and take over the village in its entirety. So now the Russians, let's see, they're about 1.3 kilometers away from taking it over in its full extent. And following that point, the Russians would have access to the road leading to Dakhne from the south, and there would be no other organized settlement through which the Ukrainians could resist the Russian advances in this area north of the Sukhuyali River up until you reach Ulakli, which isn't even in the pocket that is forming right now around Dakhne and the region west of Kurakhove. And so that's really why the Ukrainians are trying to drag out the fighting here, and it's why the 37th Marine Brigade is playing a big role in doing so. Also, the Russians are pretty close to taking over this waste treatment plant, but the fighting is not really focused on that location. A bit to the north, you're seeing now the Russians begin to consolidate control over the entirety of the western outskirts of Kurakhove. So even though Ukrainian sources are starting to come and acknowledge that the Kurakhove urban cluster is no longer under their control, and a lot of the geolocations have also indicated that there are a few locations that haven't been addressed, and that's why in yesterday's video I did not show that the entirety of the industrial zone was under the control of the Russians, and that was just due to the ambiguity of the situation. Even though I have always acknowledged that the Russians are likely taking control over these areas, we just didn't have proof of it, any direct proof. Now it's beginning to come out based on reports from the Ukrainian side, like Deep State and their iteration of the front lines, that these areas, including the thermal power plants, the Electrostal station over here, and nearby facilities, which amount to 0.7 square kilometers, have been taken over by the Russian side. But you also have this mechanical plant over here, and I still don't know what's going on with it because there's no footage and there's no mention of a retreat here. But it is definitely possible that it has been abandoned already. You also have the substation and some of the nearby houses. So all these regions are still up in the air as to their status right now, but the trend is pretty clear given the fact that the Russians are beginning to en masse get control of the industrial zone, and they're going to turn it into their own forward hub for launching attacks westwards. And at the same time, you have this parallel attack occurring a bit to the south, where the Russians have been able to consolidate control over 3 square kilometers of territory in open fields south of the industrial zone, a lot of it including trenches that were built by the Ukrainians in 2015 to act as a sort of southern defense ring around Kurakhove to prevent Russian assaults. But of course, we know how the course of the battle went, and the fact that the Russians were largely able to infiltrate and take it over from the east and then move through horizontally. That's something that the Ukrainians were not expecting because of the layers of defense in Maximilianivka, Herhivka, and Marinka. And that's why Marinka was so critical. And I sort of talked about this in yesterday's video, but the Russian forces in Marinka didn't really receive a lot of credit, and it was never viewed as a key part of the front line in relation to other areas like Bakhmut throughout like the 2023-2024 early period. But you could see now how the rewards are being reaped by the Russian units that really fought hard in the original battle in Marinka and then sort of paved the way for the advance all the way up to Kurakhove that have occurred over the past week. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward. And now, when it comes to Dakhnia, Ukrainian forces are trying to consolidate around there. They're definitely going to try to drag out the fighting in Dakhnia in order to buy time, albeit not a lot of time, buys just a modicum of time for whatever Ukrainian reinforcements are located in Andrivka, Kostiantynopil, and Lockley. And the garrison here consists of the 46th Air Assault Brigade, but you also have support from the 21st Special Purpose Battalion. You have some TDF forces like the 117th. To the north, protecting Shevchenko, you have the 35th Marine Brigade. And then you have other air assault units like the 79th defending generally in this location, along with Jaeger Brigade, another TDF unit. You have the 214th Up 4 Special Battalion. They've been very active on the front line, along with some reconnaissance battalions. And apparently also the 144th Infantry Brigade. But given everything we talked about with the 15 brigades created over the past year and a half, I don't know how much of this unit is acting as a unified force. Something that I'm probably going to try to look into and tell you guys what I find. Another unit that is pretty well known around here is the 108th Mechanized Battalion. They are pretty offensive minded units. At least now they're conducting an active defense and they have a strong drone corps. So they're involved in defensive work over here. Looking a bit to the north, the Russians have been able to infiltrate west of Solnsivka into Petropavlivka. They took over 1.7 square kilometers of territory. This Russian assault grouping that was pushing across the open fields over here made it to the hamlet and then endured shelling by the Ukrainian side. And that's a pretty good indication to us that the Russians are in this location. But they've not been able to take it over in its entirety. Now the work is going to be to expand the foothold and get control over the entirety of this one street. And given the pace with a lot of similar sized villages, it does appear that they're going to be successful. The issue is with the fall of Petropavlivka, Slovyanka is going to be just completely isolated because imagine the routes you'd have to go through to go from Andrivka or any other position to the west all the way to Slovyanka. Slovyanka itself is so disconnected from any other Ukrainian garrison, from any other village where Ukrainian troops are stationed. And so then you could see the fall of Slovyanka as well. And then you have this free reign, if you're on the Russian side, to push westwards, to push, say, 5-6 kilometers westwards and take over this key highway that was previously connecting between the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk and Andrivka. But now it's going to be used as an avenue through which the Russians could advance southwards and infiltrate the northern line of defense and reach Andrivka directly. So that's something to keep in mind going forward. And it's why the Russians have now activated the front line in this location. It's also an area that may be weaker in Ukrainian defenses, both in terms of static defenses, because you see that this region from, say, Ukrainka all the way to Petropavlivka, this like 9 kilometer area, just lacks in static defenses. And that's something that is pretty short sighted, but at the same time, it was not expected. It was not anticipated by the Ukrainians that the Russian assaults would be coming in from the east in this location because they were not expecting Selidova to fall at such a rapid pace. But following the fall of Selidova, they did not do enough to sort of make up for that, to compensate for the lack of previous investment in trenches running along this eastern location. What they didn't anticipate is that at some point the Russians would attack from the south, and so that's why you have this line built to the north of Andrivka and why you have this anti-tank ditch over here. But then what I don't understand is why they didn't build anything south of Andrivka as well, because that could also leave the city very exposed in the coming weeks and months. But in any case, you see besides Andrivka, this entire region, this massive piece of territory, just massive swath of open fields, and it's largely located on a ridge as well. So it is a strategic location. It's about 100 square kilometers in size, probably more even, and it would be completely exposed to Russian armored assaults. And in this area, you've seen a decrease in Russian armored assaults. And that means that in turn, the amount of armored losses has decreased. And so the Russians probably would have the ability to muster up the necessary amount of armored equipment in order to launch a large scale attack now that is absolutely necessary to do so. And then they would be able to fill the vacuum in this location and create a lot of trouble for the flanks of the villages here, these 5 villages or 6 villages located north of the open fields, and for the entire what rivers here, Vovcha River Valley, running from Andrivka all the way to the border between Donetsk and Dnipro, all the way to, say, Novopavlivka, a really important rear hub. And so this is just a huge midterm issue for the Ukrainians, and I have not seen a solution for it proposed. I haven't seen a solution when it comes to units being moved into this area to at the very least operate around here, because a lot of the Ukrainian volume is located a bit to the southeast. And I also haven't seen any work on trenches over here, but that's a bit understandable because at this point, sending in large engineering equipment and sending in engineering regiments is unrealistic because the Russians would see that and strike them from pretty close distance. So the only solution that is more long term and more feasible would be to build a bit closer to the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. And so that's what we're seeing over here based on new satellite imagery. And it was compiled and put into a KML file by Playfra. It's a very good account that I follow. And so I'm going to link their account and their work in the description because they deserve the credit for the trench map in yellow and for the anti-tank ditch map, which is here. I put it in a bright blue color so you guys can distinguish between them. But you can see how the Ukrainians recently built it up in this border region and also between the cities of Slovyanka and Novopavlivka, because these are areas where the Ukrainians can work at like a reasonable distance from the front line, but still retain control over key strong points that are near the border. But it also implies that the Ukrainians are aware of the fact that they may end up losing these fields, and they're just working on a contingency scenario to prevent even further bleeding. But just to look a bit to the north, I want to zoom over here on Novoyelizavetivka. You can see that the Russians have taken over additional territory in the village. So the 11th National Guard Brigade, their FPV struck a Russian tank near the dam over here, indicating that the force was able to even make it a bit to the south of the village. And now, for the most part, it is under Russian control, meaning they have an open route to reach Nadivka and really run along this entire river valley all the way to the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. In this location, the distance is about 11 kilometers, so it's a bit farther than the closest point. But again, this region past Nadivka is just completely open. There's a lack of trenches. There's a lack of Ukrainian resources put into this region, and it expands even to the area on the Dnipro side of the border up until you reach the Solona River. And it's a 66 square kilometer piece of territory, so it's not an area that you want to cede lightly. The Ukrainians, for years now, they've been fighting for every single square kilometer in open fields and in various villages and larger cities within Donetsk Oblast, within the heart of it. And now you have this threat that in the areas a bit to the west, once the Russians sort of push through a lot of the thick defenses, now have the ability to move at a faster pace with less threats of encountering, strong resistance in certain points. And so I really am interested to see how the Ukrainians account for it, if their drone crews would be enough to dissuade the Russians from thinking about launching sort of larger scale assaults through these open fields to flank villages from the rear, because you could see that already unfolding if the Ukrainians aren't able to build up a strong defense component in these locations. A bit to the north, though, you could see here that the Russians were able to advance 1.2 square kilometers, and this is in an area north of Novoyelizavetivka. This occurred on January 1st. You had the 59th Brigade. They conducted FPV strikes onto Russian armored vehicles and onto Russian troops that dismounted in these locations in tree lines south of Usmanivka. And maybe this is what the Ukrainians are hoping, that their drone components in each individual brigade are so strong that they would be able to spot large-scale armored columns beforehand and then break them up and then pick off the infantry with grenade drops, because that's what's happening in this area, and it is in an open region that's not really connected to any other villages. And when we talk about villages, here you can see the Russians were able to take most of Novovasilivka after really fierce clashes over the holiday season. So here you can see on January 1st, the 59th Brigade, their tank battalion is operating around here. And the video shows how the tank fired directly into Russian hands, into where the Russians are located in the houses themselves. Now, a bit to the north, you also have the Russians taking over most of what's left of Solone, and so you could see how the walls are caving in for Novovasilivka and for basically any other Ukrainian holding that is along the southern bank of the Solona River. And then the Russian attention could turn towards Uspanivka and some of the remaining villages running along this river line. So let's see here. The extent of the Russian distance until the border is about 7.6 kilometers away. So it is very, very close. And you could see how the anti-tank ditch has been built over the past couple of months. It starts over here in Slovyanka on its eastern approaches, runs southwards, and then sort of simmers out east of Mezhova, another really important village, both in terms of its elevation, its supply status, And yeah, now it has a lot of trenches also on its eastern approaches. And then you could see how there's another line starting just south of Serhivka, running all along the border, all the way to Novoukrayinka, which is along the Vovcha River Valley, and it's protecting Novopavlivka. And this is actually an artillery garrison. You have a lot of Ukrainian artillery units located in these border towns. So this is a very important area for the Ukrainians to retain. It's actually a higher elevated one. We're going to zoom in on elevation in a moment. But I just want to show you guys that in addition, the Russians have taken over nearby fields after they captured Vovkove. It amounts to 1.3 kilometers in total captured. So now you can see how the battlefield is being shaped in a way wherein the Russians can make a move for the rail line running into Pokrovsk. I've highlighted this now a couple of times, and I'm going to continue doing so because I think it's very important to look at the moves that the Russians could be doing over here and how it could affect the course of the urban battle in Pokrovsk. So just keep an eye out for the fact that the Russians are now like 2 kilometers, or in some cases even less kilometers away from this rail line from the TO606 or TO406 highway and from Udachnia. But the Ukrainians are hoping that they have a pretty solid defense line in this location because even though you can't really see it on satellite imagery, they do have some trenches near the windbreaks. They also have some natural defenses, both in terms of reinforcements, because there are a lot of reinforcements deployed to this area. We're going to get to one in a second, but you could see that there are two gullies running near Udachnia. That's going to be an advantage for the Ukrainians because it just slows down the Russian assault. There are a few of these forested patches that the Ukrainians are going to try to trick the Russian infantry in. There's a local slag heap marked over here, so that is an important elevated area. You have this reservoir here. You have a couple of populated regions before you reach Udachnia, and then fighting in the village itself is necessary in order to secure control over the region between Udachnia and Kotlina, which is what the Russians are looking to do. So the task of holding on over here is going to be assigned partially to the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, which is a unit operating around here. 32nd Mechanized Brigade, they are infamous in terms of just the NATO training and equipment that they've received over the years, and the fact that they previously operated around Velyka Novosilka because I had like missing persons reports from those areas. So I had them previously marked in that location, but based on recent footage from the brigade and also from its umbrella unit, which is a drone element, they are now operating around here. They've been moved to provide defense for the Ukrainians. So that's very important moving forward. But the Russians are dangerously close to reaching the rail line over here, and then that would play a massive role in disrupting the supply lines and changing the dynamics of the elevation in favor of the Russian side. So now let's look at elevation for a moment. So you can see pretty generally as a rule of thumb, whenever you have a populated area and it just extends along a line, that area is on lower elevation. So I'll mark that, say in yellow for you guys over here. This entire Vovcha River Valley is on extremely low elevation, and it makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to move in equipment closer to the line of contact. On the other hand, you have the Ukrainians in control of this massive ridge that I'm going over in red for you guys. And then there's a lower elevated area just slightly to the north. So that's an area that could be exposed in a potential Russian flanking assault. And if there's any weak points nearby as well. So you can see here there's another lower elevated valley. The Russians are pushing through that right now with their fighting in Novoyelizavetivka. Then a bit to the north, you can see that there is the Solona River. So that's also running along really, really low elevation. And it sort of starts in Selidoves for you guys. This region here, just south of the Solona River Valley, is on high elevation. I'm marking its perimeter. It's an area that the Russians worked hard on capturing, and now they're able to use that as an advantage in the local clashes. Then to the north, you have the Pokrovsk region on high elevation, and it extends northwestwards to the E50 highway, but also over here along the rail line, running all the way to the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. So these are important locations for the Ukrainians to maintain control over. So all of that is important to keep in mind. Some of the border regions between Dnipro and Donetsk are on low elevation, but more generally, this line between Slovyanka to Novopavlivka is on a pretty high elevation. So that is another advantage for the Ukrainian side. Now, to be clear about elevation, you have the massive ridge that then feeds into Pokrovsk, centered around Mezhova specifically. So that would be this area over here. I'm going to mark it for you guys. It looks something like this. and you could see it's almost like a fidget spinner when you're looking at its sort of shape that it forms. And then to the north and south, you just have these massive extensions of the river valleys from the Donetsk region, and then that actually runs through Novopavlivka. So I should correct the fact of the matter and say that Novopavlivka is on lower elevation, and this entire yellow region sort of runs along that lower river valley. And the same thing with Slovyanka, and all of the other positions along this highway running all the way to the Pokrovsk region, where then at that point the valley simmers out. That's also on low elevation, and also a bit to the south over here. All of the positions between the border of Dnipro and the Novopavlivka region that I'm going over with this yellow color, they're also on really low elevation, and it's also just a largely unpopulated region. So it has really the worst of all worlds when it comes to being a defensive place that could be held onto, which is why I'm saying that the fall of Andriivka could have massive effects for every single Ukrainian position within the confines of what is right now the line of contact, all the way up to this river line between the Sukhyali River that then connects to Novopavlivka. So you have the potential for 27 or up to 30 kilometers of territory going westwards to fall into Russian hands following the collapse of an area like Andriivka, because the geographic conditions would not be suitable for defense over here. So over time, the Russians would eventually be able to shape that battlefield in a way or basically run along this river line. And so already the Ukrainians have to look at ways to strengthen their positions along areas like Komar and Novopavlivka, and running all the way up northwards along the border, because they don't want to experience a deeper infiltration over the next year or so in this area. Now, in relation to Vozdvyzhenka, we now have proof that the Russians are, at the very least, at the western entrance, or at most in full control of the village. So here on January 1st, the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade raised their flag. This is interesting because the 5th Brigade, they're the ones that played a massive role in taking control of Kurakhove. So either they've been rapidly redeployed or they're just split up. I think it's the latter. I think some of their battalions are operating around here, and they were the ones involved in the capture of this village. So at the very least, the Russians have taken over what amounts to just a bit less than 40 hectares. Vozdvyzhenka was a really important Ukrainian frontline node. They were able to hold the Russians, keep them at bay over here for months upon months. I think like maybe 5 or 6 months in total. And the Russians just, they died down their intensity of assaults. Recently, it's had a bit of an uptick, and you also have proof from the Ukrainian side recently that they've used just the Air Force. They used the French ASM 250 Hammer precision guided bombs, not necessarily on Vozdvyzhenka, but they flew over it, I believe, in the video that was recently released from the Ukrainian side. And they bombed positions that the Russians were probably using as staging points nearby in the Cheratina region. So that was, I believe, the first time that the 250 Hammer was utilized by the Ukrainian side, and it was utilized by the Su-25 attack aircraft. So the bomb has GPS, inertial, and infrared guidance, but that's a bit besides the point. When it comes to Vozdvyzhenka, it is really easy to hold on to because it is surrounded by bodies of water and various fortresses built by the Ukrainian side. But now the Russians have been able to push into it. What this means is that there's now an opportunity to advance along this road over here and cut off the connection between Pokrovsk and the wider eastern part of Donbass. So all of the Konstantinivka area, all the Toretsk region, all of the other villages running along the Chasiv Yar front as well. So that's something that would have an effect on Ukrainian logistics, but it wouldn't be that drastic because I believe the Ukrainians for a while now have started to shift away their reliance from this location, and they've had a couple of months to do so because the Russians were not able to physically cut off this road. And so I think the Ukrainians more generally are relying on roads a bit further to the north to connect between Dnipro and the front lines. So somewhere around here. But either way, it would still have a bit of an effect on the Ukrainian logistics and would also give them access to some key heights, because the fall of Vozdvyzhenka then opens up the road for the Russians to take over all of the regions between the Torets River and the highway. So this region over here, and this region is really well built in terms of defenses, and it's part of why the Russians were unable to overrun it a couple of months ago when they were advancing a bit to the south and crossed over the Vavcha River, because the Ukrainians organized a successful defensive campaign over here. And so now there is a threat of the Russians being able to expand operations and taking over these higher elevated areas. And then that would have an effect on the battles of Pokrovsk and Hordivka as well, and also Mirnohrad, the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk. And so that's something to keep in mind going forward. But it really all depends on the troop deployment and how much resources the Russians really are willing to commit into Vozdvyzhenka. And then we'll see if it's actually a larger part of the course of the Battle of Pokrovsk. But finally, let's look at what's going on in Siversk for a moment. So to zoom in over here, we just have a couple of updates that unfolded over the past couple of weeks. So you have the Russians pushing south of Vimka, taking over 3.3 square kilometers and 32 hectares. You can see the geolocations here from earlier in December. This is from the Edelweiss FPV group. So part of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade. They conducted FPV strikes and grenade drops onto Russian soldiers advancing along trenches and windbreaks. This is not relevant here. December 28th, the 109th Battalion of 10th Brigade, they destroyed the lead vehicle in an armored assault south of Vimka. So the Russians recently have put in a lot of pressure to take over this location, and so far it is holding, but it is an extremely small hamlet, and it is pretty disconnected from nearby Ukrainian positions that are much better built and have much better protection, like Siversk itself or Zvanivko. And then over here, west of Vanodarivka, the Russians have captured 1.5 square kilometers. Here's a geolocation from what is this? I want to see the actual geolocation over here. It's from December 24th from the 54th Brigade, one of the best Ukrainian units over the past couple of months, I would say, in terms of their defensive commitments. They've done a pretty good job in the Siversk front, albeit it is a lower intensity part of the front line. And in this area, they just conducted FPV strikes onto the captured strong point. The Russians have been able to infiltrate, and they haven't taken over all of it now, but they are chipping away at it. And these are some of the most important strongholds on the road to the rail line and on the road to flanking Vimka, and also on the road to, say, undermining the logistics of Siversk and flanking it from the south. So that's something to keep in mind when it comes to why the Russians are pushing through this direction. Then a bit to the north, there are a few other developments. So here you have the Russians taking over a slight chunk of territory just east of Verkhnokamianska. And let's actually see the geolocation. So the 54th Brigade and their K2 drone units, one of the best drone units in the Ukrainian military apparatus, I would say. They caused three motorcyclists to fall from their motorcycles, and then they struck one of them, killing them. A bit to the north here around Bilohorivka, there's a geolocation from the K2 units of them striking MTLBs. In the process, they captured 1.6 square kilometers, the Russian side, and were able to tighten the noose onto Bilohorivka and the positions a bit to the south. Then the Russians also infiltrated directly into Bilohorivka by capturing 1.4 square kilometers of territory and seizing many of the houses in the eastern chunk of the settlement. And here you can see on January 2nd, based on a video from the 81st Air Assault Brigade, that they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian positions that were newly acquired. So this is some of the deepest pushes made by the Russians in this village for a while. It's been a back and forth village, one that the Ukrainians have succeeded in maintaining, whereas the Russians have not really put much of an emphasis on it. But now the winds of change are becoming more clear in this location, and it will be a very important Ukrainian forward node to dislodge them from. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.